one of the quotes from the PCD from Bruce Daniel kind of stuck with me. He said, turn a vision into a tangible product, and I sort of see that with these atlases. We've been working about 6 years on it. This is going to be a talk that looks at ungulates in Wyoming and migration. Ungulates are, we're going to be, we study deer, elk, bison, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, and moose for those of you that haven't, aren't familiar with ungulates. The team that worked on it was a collaborative effort with the University of Wyoming, the Wyoming Migration Initiative, and then the University of Oregon. Matt Kaufman, it's his vision. He was the director of the project and the senior editor. We worked with wildlife biologists from their team and also a text editor. On our team was Alethea, myself. Joanna helped us with some of the final steps in the project, and then a team of graduate and undergraduate students, including several that are here at the conference, including Lauren, Riley Shempine, Dylan Molnar, Justin Minke, Bill Limpthadian, and many others. The Atlas has 5 main sections: an introduction to the species and migration, concepts of migration, a history section, science, threats, and conservation. I'm going to focus mainly on history and conservation. There's really four main things I want to be talking about here. I want to give a historical context of abundance and the extreme exploitation that happened, and then recovery and early conservation, and kind of where we are today. The Migration Initiative and the Atlas, there's a very much a conservation mission to the project, and a public outreach, and the Atlas is the flagship product for the public outreach. Just the other day we were talking with Matt Kaufman, the director of the project, and he was kind of summed it up. If we can have better maps of migration corridors, we can do a better job conserving them. Before Euro-American settlement, millions upon millions of large game animals occupied and migrated the vast landscapes of the American West. This painting by John Stanley, a member of the 1853 Northern Pacific Survey, captured a spectacular scene the surveyors witnessed. Their number was variously estimated by members of the party, some as high as 500,000. I do not think it is any exaggeration to set it down at 200,000, said the surveyor leader of the team. An early recorder of wildlife in Wyoming was Osborn Russell. Russell was a literate trapper born on a small farm in Maine in 1814. What we know about Russell is he ran away to sea at age 16. Soon after, he deserted the ship in New York along with his career at sea. He then joined the Northwest Fur Trapping and Trading Company that eventually led him west to the Rocky Mountains and connecting him with the legendary trapper Jim Bridger. He spent his early 20s in the Yellowstone area and recorded his experiences and observations in the later published Journal of a Trapper. Historian Aubrey Haynes recreated the travels from the detailed daily accounts. From June 1835 to December 1839, in the declining years of the fur trade, Russell made 4 major trapping circuits through the Yellowstone region, one of them shown here, following wildlife and American Indian routes. Here we mapped along his route what he saw and hunted on one of his circuits. From his camp on Yellowstone River on September 2nd, 1836, he noted thousands of buffalo may be seen in almost every direction, and deer, elk, and grizzly bear are abundant. Russell's observations were compiled along with many others into a historical wildlife observations database compiled by Yellowstone Park historians. This database is a comprehensive narrative of thousands of firsthand accounts of wildlife in the ecosystem during the 1800s. Their database became our window into the past of the location, abundance, and migration of ungulates in the greater Yellowstone area. In addition to Russell's maps, we created 6 species observations distribution maps. On this page pair from the atlas, we've got the 6 multiple maps, and then we've got a graph down below showing the time period of the observations, and then a sidebar of Russell's 4 circuits and what he saw. Here's a close-up of the 6 maps, which we see elk, pronghorn, bison, deer, bighorn sheep, and moose. The distribution is temporal, showing periods dating back to Lewis and Clark and up to and after Yellowstone National Park was founded in 1872. Observations are quantified from smaller circles to a few to thousands for the large ones. And I'll note here a shout out to Riley Champagne and Bill Lipsathian for helping on these maps. This is a zoom in on the bison. Abundant in the records, what showed up was terms like abundant, numerous, countless, vast, everywhere, to describe the Wyoming landscapes alive with the immense herds. Observations confirm that the bison and other ungulates were in great number and widespread in the greater Yellowstone area, up in the upper Green, down to the south, and then up into the lower Yellowstone River, and then over onto the Snake Plateau on the east side of the Tetons. Exploration and overharvest in the extreme exploitation happened, as a lot of us know the story, occurred in the 19th century to the bison. We were to tell this story with maps and images and a timeline. Estimates of American big game herds before Columbus are imprecise, but reflect astonishing abundance. We've heard of the millions, the approximate 30 to 75 million bison, but there were also 10 million elk, 10 million mule deer, 20 to 40 million pronghorn, and 2 million bighorn sheep, that likely roamed North America. Those numbers would plummet following the arrival of Europeans. On May 10th, 1869 marked the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which linked Omaha, Nebraska to Oakland, California, and transformed the American West. The railroad shuttled settlers west and accelerated the military's work on displacing Native Americans and destroying the bison that they depended on. In the 1870s, the railroad had advertised the opportunity to shoot bison from the train windows. Enabled by the railroad, thousands of hunters pursued the remaining bison, shipping their robes and tongues east. By the 1890s, fewer than 2,000 bison likely remained. This timeline shows that in the 1830s and the 40s, predictions of extermination of wildlife were already being voiced by Russell and the American painter George Catlin and others. Later, the railroad facilitated market hunting and transport of wildlife products to eastern markets. Here we see examples of thousands of pounds of meat and thousands of skins and pelts that were being shipped by market hunters. As the 19th century came to a close, conservationists and lawmakers began to protect and rebuild wildlife populations. Legislation was started to be passed aimed at conservation, including acts by the Wyoming Territory and the U.S. government. Yellowstone National Park was formed in 1872, and in the decades that followed, new laws and better enforcement mechanisms included the 1900 Lacey Act, which made it illegal to traffic wildlife. In 1887, Theodore Roosevelt and naturalist George Bird Grinnell founded the Boone and Crockett Club. The organization established a code of hunting ethics and advocated to create national parks, forest, and wildlife refuges. With this emerging focus on conservation, the big game decimated in the previous century was beginning to recover. Fast forward to today, with new GPS technology, researchers like the Migration Initiative team are gaining new insight about the movement, threats, and conservation of migrating ungulates. In 2012, Hall Sawyer discovered the longest mule deer migration in the world, over 150 miles. The Red Desert, it was the Red Desert to Hoback migration, down by Rock Springs, Wyoming, up to the Hoback up by Jackson, Wyoming. With this discovery Hall Sawyer made this quote. In 2012, we have thousands of animals migrating 150 miles across public and private land right under our nose, and we didn't even know it. It was a watershed moment for the migration research and the research efforts in the conservation effort. And what came out of that was some important new conservation approaches, especially the development of a new tool called the migration assessment. The discovery of this particular route and then the assessment identified conservation priorities to preserve this amazing corridor that mule deer have been using for thousands of years. And one of the main priorities that was identified was the Fremont Lake bottleneck. An estimated 4,000 to 5,000 mule deer cross the Fremont Lake outlet in an area only a quarter-mile wide, surrounded by human activity and slated for development of lakefront cottages. This bottleneck was a top concern of the migration corridor. An effort was launched with many maps from the Atlas Project and shared and effectively used in efforts to really get the word out. This caught the attention of conservationists, the Conservation Fund, and then also, and through efforts of the outreach effort also included, besides news releases, we had a photo exhibit, developed a film with animated maps. It was a special, couple of science specials in the New York Times, and the word really caught on. The outreach effort was very effective, and the Conservation Fund was able to raise $2 million to purchase the 360-acre parcel of the bottleneck. With that purchase, they were able to secure the land and keep it, and then open up some of the barriers and retrofit some of the fencing for the bottleneck to make free access for the mule deer migration. And I'll just mention that Dylan Molnar worked on this map. One of the more beautiful, one of the better maps in the Atlas. So this was a real success story, and the maps played a key role in getting the outreach out there. And then 4 years later, in 2016, the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission did a policy change to adjust to mitigate impacts on wildlife corridors, and we developed the Wyoming Migration Initiative team came up with a process to identify the corridors with the GPS data and the ones to be protected. This is a map of one of the state designated migration corridors now. So that was a success. The next, one of the next steps that happened was Secretary Zinke put out Executive Order 3362 that actually designates wildlife migration corridors and their protection, and working with the 11 western states. And that's in place now, and that's had an impact on this Red Desert to Hoback migration corridor. the Department of Interior in August deferred oil and gas leasing in the sensitive migration corridor. So it's getting quite a bit of traction. And then the next steps, which Zinke had a press conference on, was getting the agencies moving together to get input from the 11 western states on conservation and resource needs and research monies to identify these corridors for protection. So I think there's definitely a lot of momentum that's happening. I'm going to close with an excerpt from the foreword that Annie Prue had written for our atlas. To conserve the state's wildlife, their migration routes must be kept accessible. To fail would be a kind of cultural death. Success would be a lasting source of pride, but Wyoming people have to work together to make this happen. Most of these people are known to be stubborn and to aggressively cherish their independence. Outstanding educational and diplomatic skills will be needed to show that Wyoming's character and identity are bound to the migratory passage of this wildlife. This atlas is the first envoy. I'd like to acknowledge there were a lot of supporters of this 6-year effort, particularly funders of the Knobloch Family Foundation, the George B. Storer Foundation, and many other organizations. Also, literally hundreds of people helped us, including a lot of topic experts with their expertise and their data, students, like I'd mentioned some earlier, cartographers, photographers. Joe Reese, his photos, and Mark Gotke's photos are in the atlas and in this presentation. Illustrators and of course the institutions I just mentioned. Thank you. If you have any questions, let me know. Happy to take them. Okay.
So, the pages you looked at that you showed look very much like the Atlas of Yellowstone. So,
How really?
so I was wondering, did this project come to you because of the Atlas of Yellowstone? What, I can see
That's
yeah,
no, it was. In fact, that's exactly what happened. Matt Kaufman, the Yellowstone Atlas just came out, and he gave me a call and he said, we want to do something very similar for all this data that we have and all the work and research we're doing on ungulate migration to really tell the migration story in a comprehensive way, and it will become the flagship product for the outreach effort. And it was with Yellowstone. There's a lot of maps that are in here, but it's not. But those maps have been used during the whole project for research articles, reports, news releases, films, exhibits. So it's like the project is this synergy, critical mass for just lots of data graphics to be created, and new data graphics that have not shown up in any research before. So there's a lot of new stuff in the atlas that hasn't been published before. Thanks, great question.